We're going to talk about worldview and need your help, because in its construct and concept, it's very, very helpful. And yet, a lot of the worldview stuff comes from a Western perspective. That's part of that's just the way it is. Not to say that doesn't mean there's no worldviews from people of other parts of the world. They are, because worldview is a very innate sense of how we see the world, how we process, how we form our worldview. There's definitely aspects that overlap and so on and so forth. But definitely in our slide presentation, a lot of the worldview stuff does come from research and philosophers and so on from a Western perspective. So that being said, that's why I need you guys' help to be able to share your perspective of worldview and so on, and we can learn collectively with each other. So before we do that, let's just read a couple scriptures. Mark 13 verse 4, the apostles asked Jesus, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are to be fulfilled?" Sign, we need to know the sign of times. 1 Chronicles 12:32 lists this men from Issachar. I hope I pronounced that correctly. They understood the times and knew what Israel should do. To understand the times, and that's in effect what worldview analysis is. We're trying to understand before we even try to get into and speak and be prepared to answer. So that being said, let me just ask you, are you familiar with the worldview concept? And if not, how would you explain this in your culture, in your community, maybe even in your language? So this is the book called The Universe Next Door, written by James Sire. It's a basic worldview catalog. If you can get this book, please do. Now, what does worldview have to do with anything? Well, worldview, especially in regards to apologetics, actually it has a lot to do with everything. But in terms of apologetics, let me ask a simple question. Are miracles possible? What do you say? Now, hopefully all of us say yes, because our worldview should actually support that. A biblical worldview should support miracles. Believe it or not, there are some who would say no. Miracles are not possible. Is spiritual warfare real? Yeah? I think, again, our worldview would say yes. And that there'll be some who won't, and we'll get to that just now. Now, what's a blessing in being in Africa is that I would say a lot of people would agree to this, that miracles are possible and spiritual warfare is real. So there's a spiritual dimension to life, is not something we need to teach. So if you're reaching out to someone from African background, we don't need to convince them that there's a spiritual realm. They know. They just go, yeah, I agree. So the reason I'm bringing that up is when we share our faith, we are looking for points of connection, not disconnection only. So that's the blessing of being in Africa. Is when we go sharing our faith, there's enough connection points that you can easily align. So you ask the question, do you believe there's a spiritual realm? I would guess most folks in Africa would actually say, absolutely. They would think you're crazy for even asking. So you're like, yes, connection point. I've had this on campus for sure, maybe you have too. Go on campus and someone will say, yeah, but Christianity is a Western religion. Yeah. Now, you immediately bring in, is there a spiritual realm? Yes, absolutely. Then they'll ask you, wait, you're Christian, yeah? Do you believe the spiritual realm? I say, yeah, absolutely. All of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, I thought Christians believe something else. So you have points of connection. So again, worldview in Africa actually is a blessing, because they actually is points of alignment. Did you know that? So next time you go on campus in Mozambique or Zimbabwe and you ask someone, do you believe in the spiritual realm? They'll say yes, and then you can say, I'm a Christian, I also believe in the spiritual realm. It might be a good starting point for a conversation. Because what is in the spiritual realm and so on and so forth, those are where nuances start happening, right? But worldview actually um, it helps in acknowledging the communality. Does that make sense? Now there'll be others you ask, and they will tell you that no, spiritual realm don't exist. That maybe in America, I don't know, Jake, but certainly in Europe, I can assure you, more than not, in Europe, they would tell you spiritual realms don't exist. That's all just nonsense. So again, isn't that nice to be in Africa? So I'll give you 3 very broad worldviews. Worldview is a complex topic. Gives me a headache even to think about it. It's a lot. And it's fascinating at the same time. So, theistic. Theistic simply is this. There is a God. Yay! And He's all-powerful. And He's relational. And He created everything. And He's with us. In other words, He's not, and you'll see that just a minute, in the deist worldview, God is with us, God is present, He's not absent. That's a theistic worldview. Now, have you heard the word pantheism? Pantheism is basically everything is God type thing. All right? Now, that is a theistic worldview gone wild. So in effect, pantheism doesn't differentiate between, like this TV could be God. God could be in the TV. At least that's what Hindus believe. Now, again, that's what I was taught by my grandmother, okay? Yeah, everything. Every animate, inanimate objects has God in it. So you can't kick, I'm not, this is what I grew up with, so you can't make fun of me. So I can't kick, so if I kick the chair, I kid you not, I'd have to say sorry to the chair, because God could be in the chair. Okay, so that's theism though, because God is with us, but literally there's no distinction. God is, in everything, so theistic worldview teaches us that. Christianity is a theistic worldview, but there's difference between God and creation. But we'll get to biblical worldview towards the end, because that's what we want. I think, Michael, you said we want biblical worldview, not human worldview. Does that make sense? Deistic. Deism, God exists, and God creates. However, God creates the universe like a machine or a clock that then He winds and He leaves it to run based on natural processes. So like evolution, for example, and a bunch of other natural processes. Now in a deistic worldview, God is just plain distant, because He basically gets things going and He goes off and far away. He just kind of watches intently or maybe even disinterestedly. I don't know. That's where you have variations in the worldview. Depends on who you ask. And there are no miracles because God doesn't interfere or intervene. That's the deistic worldview. Now this actually is important because the deistic worldview, again, you can study this stuff out. It's complex and lots to be said about it. But in a very simplistic way, the theistic worldview, God is here, and you take that one step further. The church speaks for God, and then the church does whatever the church does, and then says God is the one doing this through the church. Eventually, people got tired, and they said, "We don't want to just it's not on. You can't just do whatever you want and let's say God told you to do it." So I'm oversimplifying. But that's where kind of deism evolved, I think, to use that word intentionally. So people said, okay, there's a God, but He's far away. So He can't be talking to you right now. So the God just is there. He's let things work here. And we are the ones through whom He's going to do the work. Now this is actually very important if you think about, not to, in a sense, oversimplifying, but it's not that far of an exaggeration. You have things like colonialism, comes from deism. Because if God is there out not interfering and He's left the world to run By whom? By people. Then they're in charge, so they'll do whatever they want. All the access to resources and so on, and everything is theirs. Now, that's the irony, right? Colonialism is not this case where someone comes to, for example, Africa and says, you know, God is no longer here. He exists, but he's kind of out there. But he has left you guys in charge. So tell us how to live. That's not how colonialism worked, right? That's not how they come and they tell you who's in charge. They're in charge. That's just human nature, right? But that's the thing with deism. Deism, once God's out, get out, well, I'm in charge now. And then I'll do whatever I want because God's put me in charge. And so deism is a fascinating concept, but then evolves to naturalism. God's distant, might as well just be completely gone. There is no God. Everything runs through natural processes. So if you go to Europe, I'd guess, and ask someone, is there a spiritual realm? The answer you would most likely get, you can try it out next time if you're ever in Europe. I know I will. Yes. The most likely answer, if you poll 100 people, is no, there is no spiritual realm. That's just all nonsense. So again, this is not a linear scale. I can't pronounce the word linear very well. Angie corrects me on it. But you get what I mean. It didn't go from this to this. It's all messy. Everything is messy because humans are messy. But theism is a personal God. Deism is a distant God. Naturalism, there is no God. Now there's some interesting results. So there's byproducts of worldviews. Again, worldviews are complex. There's so many different types and categories and this and that. But check out a simple example. Deism, naturalism, distant God, no God. Well, if there is no God, or God is really distant, oh man, then I'm God. You God. Like self is God. Yeah? So that can then lead to individualism as being a current or an offshoot or a result of that worldview. Does that make sense? Again, these are complex. They're not simplistic. Please don't think of them as simple formulas. But there's something happening that kind of generates a mindset, a worldview, an attitude, value system, and we'll get to that in just a bit. So very broadly, there is a God. God's distant. There is no God. So do you see, next time you want to complain about evangelism, do you see, if you're in a culture that mostly recognizes there is God, even if God is distant, is that not a wonderful opportunity to share our faith? Hey, would you like to know this distant God? What if I told you this distant God came and lived amongst us? And who would that be? Jesus. Isn't that cool? Now, again, next time we're on campus and it's hard to share our faith, we get a lot of no's. Next time you're on campus and you get discouraged, like, man, no one wants to study, just remember you're in a worldview that still believes there is a God, even if God is distant. And just transport yourself to another place like Europe, where most people don't believe there's a God. That is an anomaly, to believe there's a God. And then you can go, okay, all right, let me get back up there and just see if people want to come to know this distant God who came to us and who wants to have a relationship with us. And it's a cool way of looking at worldview evangelism. And as I mentioned, there's these currents of consumerism, individualism, pleasure. These could be seen as worldviews themselves, although they could also be seen as offshoots or currents or results of worldview. Again, I've seen it both ways. No need to get caught up in semantics. These are not just cognitive, meaning these are not just things we think about. These are in fact things we live. And I think I have this here in my next, the worldview iceberg. So these are hidden in a sense. You may not even know what your worldview is, although you have one. Or you can ask your neighbor or your friend or your classmate. Because it's not something we walk around going, my worldview is this, therefore I do that. It just doesn't, we don't operate like that. But they're definitely driving our life, which is more in the visible. I'll skip this. does a baby have a worldview? A baby's worldview is forming. And so again, questions you may want to think about. What factors contribute to worldview formation? And this is very important. Worldviews are dynamic. They can change. This is a helpful book, Steve Wilkins, Mark Sanford, Hidden Worldviews. And so they talk about story. Story is our interpretive grid. Now, another way of thinking of story would be messaging. That's kind of, I don't know if you find that to be a common, I know I find that very helpful, messaging. Commercials or, well, there's a messaging happening, right? The messaging, and that could be seen as story. It's our interpretive grid. So what could be a messaging? I'm lovable, or I'm not lovable. And there's a story that goes behind that messaging. So when you're growing up, you just received love, support, encouragement. I met someone who came from very poor, humble beginnings, very, very poor. And they're quite successful now. But this person's mom and dad was very supportive. So they grew up with not much food, not much money. I think the mom was a domestic worker and dad was a gardener. So they're very, very poor, but very like they supported these are probably around my age now. And so their story, even though they come from poor beginnings, humble beginnings, their story is that they're loved, they're supported, they're encouraged, they were fed as a child. So to this day, that person walks around knowing that they are loved and they're lovable. It's wonderful to actually, and the way they talk about their family, the parents, and the sacrifice, and it's very inspiring. I'm hoping one day he can talk to our campus ministry. But the amount of things he has accomplished is just like amazing. But you can see the groundedness, it's fascinating. And Angie and I, we came outside after that, we said, wow, that's secure attachment. So again, interpretive grid. It shapes their worldview. So for someone to tell them they're not lovable would be like, I don't know what you mean, because I know I'm loved. So it's amazing, That shapes identity. The identity is who am I? Again, notice these are all under the iceberg. When it comes to story or interpretive grid or messaging, think of like, and if, I wish we had time to do this, think of like the number one story that pops in your mind, or top 2 stories or 3 stories that pop in your mind when you think of your childhood. And you will see something pop 1, 2, 3, just quickly it'll come up. It's without thinking. And that generates a messaging that then undergrids your identity. Your convictions, that shapes your convictions or ideology. That then it then identifies or results in or helps you to prioritize. That's what values are, right? You prioritize. How do you determine your priority? So we talk, for example, if your priority is money, and you to be wealthy or to be self-sufficient or to be to be self-sufficient, then you will prioritize that over relationship. So let's say you have a job you can get that will take you away from your friends and family. You won't even hesitate because your value, your priority is to make money. You may not have many friends to begin with, but whatever friends you do have, you don't mind leaving because your priority is very different. And that comes from possibly your ideology, identity, and your messaging that you have internalized. Ethics, what's good, what's bad. Sometimes, have you ever wondered, like, how can someone do something and sleep and live with themselves? Well, that's their worldview. It's different. It's just what it is. I asked Angie about, because they do worldview psychology. I mean, they do, in psychology, they do worldview. I said, how can you tell someone's worldview? She said, simple, what they do. Their behavior actually shows you their worldview. I was like, wow, I thought she was going to give some deep, answer. But I was like, wow, your actions actually reveal your worldview. It's fascinating. So what we do shows what story or what messaging we emphasize. Something to think about. And as Michael said, this is what we want though. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, sorry. Yeah, at least I didn't say to a God. Holy and pleasing to God. There's only one God who reveals himself in Jesus Christ, and his Spirit lives with us, yes. I'm a staunch monotheist. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by renewing of your mind. Have a worldview conversion. So if you haven't heard this word, I think it's a very cool way of thinking of conversion. It's a worldview conversion. And I was thinking about this yesterday. So again, I said this today. It is really a miracle we get converted with such minimal understanding of the Bible. It's truly a miracle. Because worldview conversions are actually difficult. Because you're changing your most inmost kind of your sense of self and all of that. And I don't know how long it took you, but it took me like probably 6-7 weeks to get converted from a Hindu to a Christian. And I was sold out, man, for Christ. There's no doubt. Like I had a worldview conversion. I had to work it out. I still work it out. But like we celebrate when someone gets converted, and we should, because it really is a celebration. Because it's truly God's miracle that we are actually repenting and baptized and having a worldview conversion. But also, and I love Jesus, he knows everything. That's why he says continue to teach them. Because worldview conversions, like I said, worldview is dynamic. So you don't just change and just continue. You can actually go back. So you got to have constant teaching.